Today, the next session, you get to hear from another 5 of our incredibly brilliant and awesome postdocs. And so I'll do very brief introductions for each. And the first is Laurent Hébert-Dufresne. He has a PhD in theoretical physics from Laval University in Quebec. And he's now a postdoctoral fellow at SFI. He holds a James A. McDonald Fellowship in studying complex systems. Laurent is interested in finding overarching principles that can lead to a more complete view of complex networks, with a particular interest in understanding disease propagation on social networks.
All right, thank you very much. So as Jen said, I'm very interested in networks and how they affect how disease spread in society. And here I wanted to give a good example of stuff that we've been looking at over the last year, which tries to illustrate the fact that we have no idea how epidemics actually occur and how they spread. So in this case, I'm going to talk about a very simple behavior, something that we would call a prudent behavior that can actually have very unexpected effect. So the behavior in question is something that we've all done. We wake up one Monday morning, we're not feeling well, we call in sick to work, which means that probably someone at your job is going to have to take some of your workload, maybe go to some of your meeting, get some of your social contact. So maybe the more canonical example of that is a teacher who ends up sick. The school has to bring in a substitute teacher. So in this case, in this little cartoon, the bottom red node would be an infected teacher, decides to stay home. In scenario number 1, you have student number 1, which is blue, so he's healthy. And in this case, getting a substitute teacher is good for him because then he loses a potential infection. But the more likely case, perhaps, because children being children, is that student number 2 will be sick, either because that student is the one that infected the teacher in the first place, or because he was infected by the teacher. Now, in that case, not only are you not protecting the student, but you're actually putting your substitute teacher in a more dangerous situation. So it's hard to see how those two scenarios can be put together and what the trade-off will be. So we came up with a simple model, very sexy model that we can do all the math on. And here I'm going to focus on one result that we get. So this is a classic picture. As time goes on, you can expect the epidemic to grow in size. So this is a log scale. So the beginning of the epidemics follow a straight line. So it's the idea that it's an exponential growth. I infect 2 of my friends. They both infect 2 of their friends, and so on. Until at some point people start recovering, they now have some limited immunity to, let's say this is a flu season, so they now have a limited immunity to flu, and then you go past the peak of the epidemics, and the curve goes back down. Now this is what we get with replacement. This is the idea that at first you're going to have more children or coworkers that are in the scenario number 1. You're actually protecting them by staying home because the epidemic is not that big. But at some point, you're going to get more people that are in scenario number 2, where you're actually putting people at risk by taking over the workload of your coworker that is sick. So in this case, you see an acceleration of the disease, and you see a much thinner peak of influenza. Now this is a pretty clear signal, and it's very different from the classic scenario, so we can look for that in the data. So this is what a typical influenza season looks like. So around December or January, you're going to get a flu peak, but there's a big incentive to try and predict exactly when that peak will be. So what people do is they use early data, so maybe up to mid-November, and they're going to try and fit the classic model, which is simply an exponential growth. Now, as you can see, this model in this case, in the 2012-2013 season, does not do so well. But the fact is that we know that the exponential growth, exponential spread for disease is actually a good model in most cases. So this is a season of dengue. And as you see, this is way closer to the original picture that we had. Originally exponential, then you sort of see a slow decay after the peak. But in the case of influenza, we see this regime just before the peak of accelerated growth. So if you compare this picture with the dengue, it very much mimics the blue and red curve that we had here. So this is telling us that, well, perhaps this sort of accelerated spread that we see in influenza is caused by adaptive behavior that occurs in the population. Now, there are other drivers for influenza. For instance, climate, humidity plays a large role, but we can go back and look for the signal across time. So here we have 16 years of influenza, and in every single season, we see this regime of accelerated growth. Even in the 2009 pandemic, H1N1, which occurred out of sync with the classical seasonal forcing. We can also look across space. So in the US, we're just missing data for Vermont, but in every single state, more than half of the flu seasons, on average, almost 3/4 of them, are going to have this regime of accelerated growth. And even in state like Arizona, where the seasonal forcing would be expected to be much lower. So putting all that together, we think, this is a little bit controversial right now, but we think we have evidence that this regime of accelerated growth might be better explained by our adaptive behaviors to flu season, just hearing about it, just staying home, having your husband pick up the kids instead of you, simple stuff can actually drive that accelerated growth. Now, the policy application of that we're trying to work on is the idea that we should have different policies, or that personally we should have different reaction to flu season depending on where we are before or during the peak. So just before I run out of time, I should say that this is work in collaboration with Sam Scarpino, who is also at SFI, who I think you probably met yesterday, and Antoine Allard, collaborators of ours, which is at the University of Barcelona. So thank you very much.
Next is Chris Kempis. He has a PhD in physical biology from MIT, and before joining us at SFI, he was a visiting scholar at Caltech and a postdoctoral scholar at NASA Ames Research Center. He's an Omidyar Fellow at the Institute. And Chris is interested in how various physical and abstract constraints organize evolutionary and ecological structure at different spatial and temporal scales.
Great. So much of my work focuses on the connection of biological morphology and evolution. And the reason that I'm so interested in biological structure as a whole is because for me it really is the thing that sits in between what's happening internally for an organism and the external environments that different organisms must cope with. And so in thinking about lots of different types of morphology, the questions I tend to focus on are, over evolutionary timescales, how much of what we see in terms of cellular architecture, the arrangements of organisms, can be predicted from simple physical constraints. And going the other direction, when we see some piece of biological architecture, how much can we use physics to then infer something about the detailed physiology of that organism? And so the systems I tend to look at range in scale from single cells to communities of billions of cells, all the way up to forest ecosystems. And today I want to just very briefly give you an example of what we look at in forest systems. So when we see a complex forest ecosystem like this, with lots of different species and spatial arrangements and sizes of trees, are there a few simple parameters that allow us to make detailed local predictions about this forest, given, say, variations in meteorology or local climate? And so building on very classic work from the Santa Fe Institute that looks at the fractal architecture of trees, where once we write down this fractal and optimize the hydrodynamics and the mechanical properties, we can understand what sorts of solutions evolution should pick optimally. We can then take this and start to put it into real environments and write down the dominant constraints of resources. So either from an energy perspective or a nutrient perspective or even a soil moisture and water perspective. And this actually becomes a fairly small set of constraints that allows us then to integrate, say, meteorological conditions over the United States to predict things like the maximum possible tree size. So if you tell me what your local meteorological station is giving you over long periods of time, I can tell you what the largest possible trees you should see in that environment actually are. And because this is rooted in a small set of physical constraints, we can also think about perturbations to the climate system and what that implies. So here's a plot then of cases where we've increased or decreased mean annual temperature by plus or minus 2 degrees. And you can see that there's a fairly dramatic response in maximum tree height on the order of about 10% nationally. And it's these sorts of processes that we're using in very recent work to start to understand some of the very basic feedbacks between vegetation and the overall planetary climate system. So one observation that we think we see in the geologic record is this snowball Earth, where at one point we think the planet was almost entirely covered in ice. And so we have questions about when you put vegetation into this system, can you actually moderate or prevent large climate swings like this, where you go from a planet with no ice to a planet that's completely covered in ice? So with that, I'm happy to take any more questions this afternoon. I'd be excited to have more conversations about any of the projects I've talked about, and thank you very much for your time.
Our next speaker is Ellie Power, who has a PhD in anthropology from Stanford University, and she's an Omidyar Fellow at SFI. Ellie is interested in broadening our understanding of signaling systems through close study of how religious belief, practice, and identity interact with and shape interpersonal relationships.
Thanks for that, Jen. And thanks for being here to listen to all of us today. And that is me. So as Jen said, I'm an anthropologist. More specifically, I'm a human behavioral ecologist. And most of the questions I ask have to do with trying to understand religion, this rather large question of what does religion do in society. Part of the reason religion is so interesting for me and for a lot of people is that people do things in the name of religion. So how can we explain that so many people donate money to the construction of the Sagrada Familia? How can we explain that these Buddhists are throwing money into the air and cooking food for people who are deceased? You wouldn't think they really need that food. How can we explain these Jain monks who disavow all possessions and have their every meal given to them by the generosity of others? And how can we explain these Catholics jumping into a freezing cold river after a cross? Certainly where I work in South India, people also do many acts that are sort of calling up these sorts of questions, is why are people doing these things? So this woman here is carrying a pot of fire through a procession. I hope no one here is squeamish. The man on your right there is suspended by hooks that have pierced the dermis of his back. He's suspended from a crane that's being swung up and down. These women have gone on a long procession, many hundreds of kilometers away from where they live, to a temple. And this young girl on her way home from school stopped at the temple and got possessed. So again, how can we explain these acts? What do these acts do for the individuals that undertake them, and what do they do for the collectives that these people are part of? So to explore these questions, I spent 2 years working in these 2 villages in the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu. Anthropologists do things like that. And I gathered information on not only the nature of people's religious practice, information on the sources of their livelihood and the rest, but also social network information that let me look at the position of each individual, the collectives that they are a part of, and let me then explore what role religion plays and the nature of people's religious practice plays in this social structure. So as a little bit of background, these villages have a mix of caste groups and also a mix of religious groups. We have Catholics, Protestants, and Hindus there. Speaking of caste, the nodes there on the top there, these are all colored by caste identities. The nodes on the top are the Dalits, the untouchables, who are somewhat relegated in this village, but in the second village where I work, they're the numerical majority. So we have a very different structural position here. So again, the question is, what role does social identity and in particular religious practice play in the emergence of these structural forms? Now, what do I do with these data? I'm testing out a series of propositions about essentially what religion does. So at the first step here, drawing on signaling theory in part, the idea is that these extreme acts that people are doing in the name of religion give us some sense of who these people are, what their motivations are, what their underlying character is. Only someone who is truly devout is going to be willing to pierce their body with 101 spears, right? So we get some sense of the nature of the individual, and that helps individuals build trust with each other and form cooperative relationships that help them get by in life. A nice example that's somewhat relevant to the topic here is if you go to someone's function, like a marriage or a coming of age ritual, something like that, you're going to give them a few hundred rupees, maybe like $5 to $10, something about that amount of money. Which means that by the end of the function, the people who have put it on literally have a suitcase full of money. This is a place where most people don't have bank accounts. So this is one of the main ways in which people get access to money, and it's through their social relations with others, and particularly those relations as they're expressed in religious life. So we can see how these nature of people's religious practice fosters these cooperative relationships between individuals. And then if we zoom out to a more structural level, the idea is that through those shared experiences, bonds are forged between individuals. Durkheim would call this collective effervescence. Victor Turner would call it communitas, this idea that religion brings people together in meaningful ways. What I'm trying to do in part is to test that out, to see if we can actually see something of an emergent community among those who worship together. There is no obvious congregation for Hindus. That idea that people come together each week and worship with moral lessons taught at them doesn't quite hold for the nature of religiosity here. So in this setting in particular, we can look at whether or not the actual act of worshiping together does foster these relationships between individuals. And just to wrap up then, I should say that these, of course, are very general processes. The process of communication, how we establish some confidence in what other people are trying to tell us, establishing cooperative relationships with other ones, overcoming selfish individuals, free riders, the rest, and the process by which communities and collectives are formed are very general processes. I happen to be looking at those within a religious setting, but at SFI I at least have to say that this should hopefully have some relevance for sociality and collective processes much more broadly. So thanks for your time.
Our next speaker is Brendan Tracy. He has a PhD in aeronautics and astronautics from Stanford University. He's a postdoctoral fellow at SFI working with David Wolpert, and he's also affiliated with the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT. And Brendan is interested in the application of non-traditional ideas to engineering analysis and design, with a particular focus on multi-information source optimization.
Thanks, Jen. So I want you to hear those words, multi-information source optimization, but forget them for a second, because I'm going to motivate why we care. So in the mid-'70s, when Boeing was designing the 767, they used somewhere around 75 wind tunnel experiments in order to finalize their design. Recently, when they were designing the 787, they did 5. So that's a dramatic decrease, and it saved them a lot of money. So what enabled this decrease? Well, the solution is the rise in computational power and the increase in our computational models for predicting behavior. So in the 70s, the simulation tools looked like this, and today, they look more like this. So we were having to make large assumptions previously, which we can now relax, and we can use these full, big models that give a lot of insight into scientific understanding and have been used to finalize the design once sort of the high-level parameters have been set. And these have sort of the final good tests that can confirm that you're right before you go to production. But what we want to do is we want to take these tools and bring them earlier in the process to be sure of our design when we're doing it at the conceptual level and not only at the final stages. So that's what I'm working to enable, is to try to bring these scientific tools into the design and the engineering process. So what's the problem? Well, this is how an optimizer today sees your problem. Your problem is a black box, and what the optimizer does is you tell it, here's what you can tweak, and here's what it looks like when you tweak it, and all an optimizer does is change those inputs. Some of them are essentially guess and check, some of them are much more smarter than that, but it has this fundamental black box structure. And so if you're an engineer today, what you can do is you can take these models from the 70s, plug them into the black box, and an optimizer can use them. Okay, great. So what we should do then is just put a different box in there. Well, the problem is that these simulations today take a long time. And so if you just swap in a new box, your design process will take much longer than you have to do it. So we need smarter algorithms than what we're using today. And that's what I'm working on developing. So instead, we want to see your problem more like this. You have a number of scientific tools that you have at your disposal. Some of them are old, like these ones from the 70s, but they're still useful. They still give you information. And then you have, say, medium-level ones, and then these high-level ones that give you very accurate information, but at a large computational cost. So, given that, say, I'm a designer, I have 48 hours to come up with a new design to tell the marketing team or whoever needs an updated design. How do I choose which designs to look at and at which fidelity? So do I want to spend a lot of time now using my expensive model, or do I want to spend a lot of time looking at my less accurate model? And so you can think about it in general, right, where if I know my design is going to be bad, I don't want to spend a lot of time looking at it. But how do I know it's bad without running my large tool? And so not only do we say want to find a couple of designs and then run those at our best model and see which one's the best, but we might want to spend some time using our really accurate models to correct our bad models. So instead we can develop these hybrid models that are the models we used in the 70s, plus some information from our good experiments today, and now we can use this iterative design process where we're managing all of these information sources to do optimization. So that's where we are now in the problem we're trying to solve, but eventually we want to move to the broader problem, which is that an aircraft is also a composition of a bunch of different systems. And each of these systems, in some sense, are distinct, but in a different sense, they're all connected. And so we, in fact, have this network of tools that are all interconnected and all give us different information. And we want to be able to use, we want algorithms that can account for this complexity and exploit the sparsity that exists in order to find good designs. So today I've talked about it in the context of aircraft design, but we're hopeful that these methodologies are actually much more broadly applicable, and I'd be happy to talk to you about trying to use our methodologies for your problem as well.
So our final postdoc speaker in this session is Marion Dumas. She has a PhD in Sustainable Development from Columbia University. She's an Midjar Fellow at SFI. Marion combines models and large-scale data sets of social structures and social behavior to understand how different economic and political institutions interact and how they shape a society's capacity to adapt, particularly to ecological constraints.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to take this opportunity to briefly honor the victims of the attacks that have occurred both in Paris and in Beirut, and unfortunately the many that will probably occur in the future. And I do not want to insinuate that economic factors are a major driving force behind these events. They're far more complex. Yet I would like, as we continue to discuss economic and currency systems, to enjoin us to reflect on how these systems allow or not individuals to flourish, and how they may play into some people and some youth's sense of isolation, alienation, in the sense that their life is meaningless without embracing a more transcendental cause. So on this note, I'm now going to tell you a little bit about my research. Writ large, the goal of my research is to understand how the organization of society affects people's ability to find collective solutions to sustainability problems. So by the organization of society, I mean political systems, political institutions, markets, regulations. So to give you a flavor, in the last 2 years, I studied the US legal system and the dynamics of the laws they generate, and more specifically how citizens interact with the system and interact with courts to try to evolve policy, evolve law, somewhat independently from the gridlock that might be happening in other parts of the political system. But today, I want to talk to you about a project I started when I arrived at SFI exactly 2 months ago, and that actually has quite strong relations with what Brendan just talked about, although it might not be as immediately obvious. And this issue is, the project is about the issue of radical innovations, the dynamics of radical innovations, and specifically radical innovations to transition to a low-carbon economy. So what do I mean by radical innovation? Radical innovation is one that requires the rethinking of whole products, of whole supply chains. Innovations that require investments by multiple firms because the technologies have many interdependent parts. So examples might be cradle-to-cradle design, or new ways of incorporating renewables into buildings. And so the thing that I'm interested in is the organization of these supply chains, the network structure, the relationships between firms affects these kinds of innovations. Of course, the question also is, how can we catalyze faster radical innovations? So to explain my perspective on this problem, I need to backtrack 8 years to my first job, which was as a consultant in France in the sustainability strategies of businesses. One of my responsibilities was to organize a regular roundtable with the major players of the construction sector. So we were trying to help them build a shared understanding of sustainability opportunities. So we would discuss new materials, new types of building designs, new policies. So what was the purpose of all of this? Well, when we ask firms individually what stood in the way of more aggressive investments in such technologies, they often invoke the risks of such strategies in terms of the likely shortcomings of other firms. So a construction company might be worried that they would spend years training workers, creating new designs, only to fall short of the materials they need. Material manufacturer say, yes, sure, we can innovate in new materials, but who's to say that we'll have the demand for them down the line? Maybe constructors will not know how to use them. So basically, we were trying to forge a collective direction for the sector with our little roundtable. And at the time, I didn't have the concepts really to think about this properly, but realized later we were trying to coordinate their strategies. So when I studied in grad school, I studied then economic growth and political development, and I saw these coordination problems crop up everywhere. Albert Hirschman, a long time ago, brought our attention to what he called backward linkages. To be profitable, a firm needs other firms, most directly its clients and its suppliers. So a whole region could stay stuck just for lack of a vibrant ecosystem of firms. Danny Roderick, an economist at Princeton who studies the emergence of markets, calls our attention to industrial policy. So industrial policy sounds terrible, sounds like state planning. But at its best, he says, it's a process of discovery between public institutions and firms to gradually learn what works and what doesn't, and eventually coordinate firms around creating winning markets. So clearly the same logic should also apply for reforming whole sectors, for transitioning to radically new technologies. But economists who dominate at the end of the day, the discussion on climate policy think they've solved this problem already. Tax carbon. You'll create incentives to adopt technologies and to innovate in new ones. This makes a lot of sense if you think of firms as individual decision makers. But if you think of them as embedded in a complex social system where their success depends on what other firms are doing at the same time, then it's not as obvious that individual incentives will do the trick and will trigger the kinds of risky collaborative undertakings that we need for radical innovation. So the goal of my project is to enrich our theory of innovation, to take into account the coordination dynamics between firms that are key to the success of a technology. And to this end, so I've started I've developed a model of the system, specifically looking at the ways in which firms mutually affect each other's opportunity for success. And in doing so, I found there are two important mechanisms that make innovation at the scale of a whole supply chain really difficult. One is a vertical problem between buyers and suppliers, because suppliers need to innovate in components in a way that's compatible with their clients' innovation. Well, that's a very difficult and risky process. And there's also a horizontal problem between competitors. Competitors may need to align their strategy because they have suppliers in common. They depend on together on other players, and they need to ensure that those suppliers can continue to provide the economies of scale they need for important components. So I'm currently solving this model, trying to understand whether indeed the sort of taxation, has a sort of limited effect on the system or not, and how the network structure affect the outcomes. And then the second goal of the project is to empirically look at supply chain networks and the innovations they generate. Can the structure of the network explain the rate of radical innovation? And do institutions that try to coordinate firms make any difference? So clearly this project could very much benefit from a collaboration with industry. So if these questions at all interest you, I would really appreciate talking about it with you in the next few hours. Thank you for your attention.
Please join me in thanking all our postdocs one more time. Another great round of applause.